we as adult mentors need to be consistently communicating to students at every age, including all the way up to the doctoral level, is that you're not learning for yourself. You're actually learning to serve others. That's the whole reason we're learning and developing ourselves, to serve others.
Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This is the show where I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. You can find this show everywhere podcasts are found. We always include Liftable, Edify, Apple, Spotify, you name it. My guest today is Summit's Director of Worldview Education. He is the author of a number of books, including Beyond Biblical Integration, a book that details the process of creating an immersive environment where the key concepts of a biblical worldview are caught as well as taught. So, this guy has served as a pastor, a university professor. He is the co-founder of one of the first Christian coach training organizations. He has been the head of 2 Christian schools. So when we're talking about back to school, this guy has a lot of great information to share. Please welcome Dr. Roger Erdvig to the show. Dr. Roger Erdvig, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here today.
This is the second time you've been on the show. So you're one of the few people who gets to come back a second time or has gotten to come back so far. So yeah, welcome. These discussions are always fascinating with you.
Well, great. It's great to be back, and I hope I'm not coming back on the second time because the first time was a flop and we have to fix it. I hope it was actually a positive experience.
It was a great experience. One thing I've loved about you as an educational innovator, as someone who's a biblical worldview expert, is that you bring a lot of practical insight to parents and to even students who are heading back to school. This is the back to school focus time, and thinking about how to really represent Christ and live out a biblical worldview in their education. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and it is an exciting time of year. I don't know if you remember when you were a kid or if you had a similar personality to me, it was so much fun to get all set up for school and go back. And I know now as I watch teachers do that, it's an exciting time. And my prayer is that there will be an excitement about what God's going to do in kids' hearts themselves and through teachers doing that too. So it is a great time of year.
Yeah. Well, you've been involved as an educator in a number of different levels. Obviously, your higher education, your doctorate, having been the head of a significant school on the Eastern Seaboard, they started different businesses, coaching people in corporations and schools and all different kinds of things. I'd love to just begin the discussion, Roger, by asking you, because I have this sense that there is kind of an educational earthquake or transformation that's kind of taking place right now.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you feel that way as well and how you would characterize it.
Yeah, there's definitely change on the horizon. And it's hard to characterize probably under maybe one umbrella or one idea, besides perhaps the broadest view of rethinking and innovating. Certainly COVID contributed to that, but it was really happening before then. And there were a number of factors, I think, that were contributing to that. One being students' emotional well-being. There's been some significant decline in students' emotional well-being and what a good friend of mine calls the sturdiness of students. So that's definitely changing how we have to educate. And this is not, I don't have in mind just the second and third grader. I'm thinking all the way up through every level of education, all the way up to the doctoral level. We have to rethink, we have to innovate, partially because students are different today than they were before. So that's one of those key driving forces.
Let's talk about what that means for parents and students who are headed back to college for this fall. And I'd like to focus our discussion around the idea of a biblical worldview.
Sure.
This is something that you've spent a lot of time thinking about, writing about. Your book that you published with Summit Ministries is called Beyond Biblical Integration. And that has spread all across the country, affecting, I don't know how many tens of thousands of Christian educators. So that's been a very exciting trend. But let's bring it down to the everyday level. What usually happens with people who think they're trying to have a biblical worldview, and what ought to happen if we're really going to have a good biblical worldview?
Yeah. Well, starting with the individual themselves. So I'm not thinking in terms of someone who's mentoring someone else yet, because really it all does start with each individual. I think the biggest challenge is what I was just reading a book that I hadn't read before, Andy Crouch's, Creating or Making Culture. And he talks about the academic fallacy. The academic fallacy applies to us as teachers, but also our individual lives as educators. And that fallacy is that we often think that thinking about something results in change or influence. Now, thinking or kind of, working through something on a cognitive level, be that in conversation or individually or through study, is super important. And it's a key element to the biblical worldview formation process. Our challenge is when we fall into this fallacy concept where we think that just thinking about it is enough. And so I would say that answers your questions. When we are thinking a lot about worldview, we're thinking about world events, we're thinking about scripture, we often think that we're developing our worldview, when in reality, we're just doing one small piece of it. And what we need to be doing and helping our students doing it and doing ourselves is making sure that we have as much a mindset towards action and change as just we do towards thinking. So I think that's a big part of what we need to be on guard against.
I'd like for you to expand on that a little bit, because I think I understand it in theory, but an example or two might be helpful.
Yeah, sure. Well, now we can kind of spill over into what we can expect in our personal lives. We should expect that what we think about should change two other dimensions of our being, and that is our desires and our habits. And as James Sire says, a worldview includes not only our thoughts, the cognitive presuppositions that we hold to be true, but also it's our desires and it is our actions or our habits. So in very practical terms, anytime we're thinking through something, we need to also consider, how should this truth claim impact what I truly want, or where my desires are, or my heart orientation, you might call it, or how should what I'm thinking about actually change what I do? Now, in the classroom, what that means is that teachers ought to be thinking about, when they're thinking about things, how to help our students actually put it into practice in ways that are meaningful. So not necessarily a classroom example where you're maybe using manipulatives for math or something like that, which is great, but actually to think about, how can I take what I'm learning and use it in service of a bigger picture perspective, which would be God's purpose for us as humans to be creators, to be cultivators. And so having that focus on having our actions and also our desires impacted by what we're learning is super important if we're going to harness the power of it for real worldview formation.
I'm thinking both at a personal level and at a societal level. We ought to be prepared to ask the question, what would this look like if we all tried to live it out?
Yeah.
In other words, I remember teachers, especially in college, giving all of these fanciful notions. Oh, we should have a 4-day work week. Oh, well, how are we going to have a 4-day work week? Well, we'll just mandate that everybody gets paid more per hour. Like, really? You think that's how a business operates, right? So you end up with all these theoretical things, like the thinking aspect, that's completely untethered from the way life really works. And I wonder if sometimes that's where education starts to really go off track. Because if you get untethered in your mind from the way the world really works, then your separation from reality is, in essence, a separation from a biblical worldview.
Yeah, and students like me, and I'm kind of chuckling because I reflect back on what I was like in high school. I was obnoxious because I was manipulatively always asking the teachers, when am I ever going to use this? Why do I have to learn this? But actually, that's a golden question. Now, some students are like me, and they're just using it to get out of an assignment or give a teacher a hard time. But the heart of that question is actually the question we should be asking. Given that we're learning these truths about whatever it is, math, science, English, language arts, whatever it is, we should be asking the question and welcoming our students to be asking the question, how am I going to use this? And so my encouragement, not to teachers necessarily first, but even to just students that are heading back to school who have a passion for their own worldview development, that should be a key question. How can I use this in service to others? How can I use what I'm learning to actually do something with it? And the interesting or the powerful part of that is the research consistently shows when we turn right away and apply what we're learning, even the most theoretical, challenging things, when we turn and apply it in some way to serve others or to care for God's creation, to steward well what God's given to us, we actually learn what we're learning at a much deeper level.
This is amazing. And to me, it would be helpful if I could understand how that works in some different areas. So, for example, I understand how learning to write an essay can help me in a lot of other practical areas of life.
Yeah.
But I do remember learning things in science and thought this class period and this lab is probably the last time I will ever be thinking about this in my life. Or this theorem in geometry is not something I imagine that I can use. Can you, I know in your writing of the book, Beyond Biblical Integration, I know you discovered and shared a lot of things about practical applications in areas of education where a lot of people didn't think there were really practical applications. I'd love to just hear some stories about that.
Yeah, and it really goes from, I would say it's on a spectrum, the idea of allowing what you're learning to actually influence and change your habits is on a spectrum. When I use habits, the term habits, I do mean actions that can develop into habits. And this is something that drives me crazy all the time, and something that I think we as adult mentors need to be consistently communicating to students at every age, including all the way up to the doctoral level, is that you're not learning for yourself. You're actually learning to serve others. That's the whole reason we're learning and developing ourselves, to serve others. So that begins on this spectrum with the most simple. When I master a challenging theorem or proof in geometry, yes, I may never use that content again in my vocation or in my daily life or running my household. However, can I look around the classroom and find someone else who's struggling and take what I've learned or what I'm in the process of learning and serve that other student by helping them, by coming alongside of them? That's like at the micro level. And we can help our students, we can facilitate that happening all the time by simply having our students pair up. Let's say, again, let's stick with the challenging geometry theorem. Have students pair up and share with each other how they learned what they just learned. And in so doing, they're actually serving someone with their learning by kind of exposing the learning process that they went through, which has a way of sharpening someone else's learning process. It could be asking for students to actually confess when they don't get something, and then pairing up students to have the one who has it mastered to share it with the other. So that's on like the first part of the spectrum. But it goes all the way to things like taking older students or more advanced students and having them turn and teach concepts to students that are a year behind or 2 or 3 years behind, all the way up to maybe taking what we're learning, complicated things, and looking for ways that we connect with community partners to help serve what they're doing to serve others in the community through these things that we're learning. So for instance, a real tangible example is if we're learning about statistics, which is a challenging thing for students to learn, and it's even more challenging to kind of conceptualize how they'll ever use statistics anywhere. They could take what they're learning with statistics. The teacher could facilitate a partnership with a local organization that could benefit from some students that would run some basic statistical analysis for whatever they do to serve the community. So that students are actually taking what they're learning and saying, wow, God's given me this as a gift. I could turn and share with another student, but look at this. I can actually turn and make a difference in my community. Now, a PS to that is this generation, the millennial generation and younger, are very passionate about serving others. They're super passionate about causes. And so if we as educators can look for ways to help students take what they're learning in the classroom in a very technical way and put it into the service of broader causes, not only will they learn what they're learning better, not only will they become more passionate, ideally, about what they're learning, but it has a way of practicing students in what an applied biblical worldview looks like when they're kind of, beyond the learning stage and they're out there doing what they'll be doing. So those are just some practical ideas, and I have lots of them that we could talk about today.
Wow. I would love to hear more. I'm just thinking of, I have a couple of my kids who are aviators, and, they use their math stuff all the time, trying to calculate fuel loads. My daughter, when she flies her helicopter, has her passengers stand on a scale. So she knows exactly how much that person weighs because it factors into actual calculations for how the machine is going to operate. And there are all those people who could come in and talk about those kinds of things. But I like the idea of service learning. And you've talked about this before, and I've always thought, yeah, it's a good idea. I like that. But I think I'm understanding what you're getting at, maybe at a deeper level, that the statements you made is super powerful, that you're not just learning for yourself. You are learning on behalf of other people.
Right.
That we aren't just individuals. That the idea of, individual autonomy is in some ways a myth, that we really live in a community, and that our learning and our digging down and focusing on doing hard things then affects other people.
Right.
And then their learning affects us, and we challenge each other and grow.
Right. And that upsets the kind of the establishment paradigm for education. Because not only do teachers think this way, but students do too. And what I mean by this way is students are looking at education largely as a transaction. In other words, I figure out what's required of me to get what I want to get. I give it to the teacher, and then I get what I have coming to me. And I find many times older students, all the way up, even in college, undergrads that I've taught, they're like, hey, don't complicate this at all by asking me to serve someone, because I got to get that A. I got to get done with this class and get that A. And we've trained our students to believe that the purpose of education is their GPA, as opposed to from the very young. Now, I know we need to do grading, but I do think we need to upset that apple cart a little bit and think about how we could better assess what kids are learning in the Google revolution age. But from the very young, we can do things in our classrooms through the habits we establish, through the way we interact with our students, through the expectations we have of them to serve others. We can actually begin to kind of create a new wave of students, ideally, that would have a different perspective on what this whole school thing is about, and that it's really for others.
Let's talk about things like, what about things like physical education, or, we've talked about math and science a little bit. What about literature, civics, some of those other areas? Can you give some examples of what this paradigm would look like in those areas?
Yeah, so I was teaching a small elective class at my school with just a couple of 10th and 11th graders in there. And it was called Faith and Liberty Heritage Studies. And it was kind of an independent course where the students would pick culture shapers from U.S. history, and they'd have to write a paper on them once every 6 weeks or so. And then at the end, they presented their papers to their peers, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that came out as a really important dynamic in that class was learning how to write persuasively, because they were working on these papers month after month. And so as we got towards the end of the class, somehow one of the students brought up the transgender boys playing girls' sports, or I should say the transgender girls playing against biological girls. And she was a super athlete, real high-end athlete, and she just really incensed about that. And so we took an assignment in the course and kind of transformed it to be a requirement that she write a letter to the editor of one of our local news outlets and submit it to be published. And it was kind of an incendiary topic, especially in the liberal state of Delaware. And so I made sure we got her parents' permission first. But instead of writing for herself, she wrote on behalf of female athletes. Now, it was the same exact assignment we would have had to do anyway. And I can't tell you how many high schools have kids write letters to the editor. But I think it's far less the number that actually gets submitted to be published, where you actually have this sense of, I'm doing this for someone else. So again, that's really a small tweak on an assignment, just to say, instead of just writing it fictitiously to try and fictitiously accomplish something in our imagination, we actually write it and craft it in such a way that we can submit it to be published. So that's an example in kind of an English civics perspective on how to do it. Another would be actually going to a legislative session, whether you can do that maybe locally with your state or even locally with your township or county. I'm not sure how it would be for people. But here, we can take students right into the State Hall in Delaware to actually experience what's going on and look for ways that the legislators there are actually serving others with a biblical worldview. So again, it's so much of a focus on taking learning outside of being about just ourselves. There's a lot of criticism of foreign language textbooks, and this will make sense in a minute. And the foreign language textbooks are often very they're communicating a worldview. And that worldview is, I as an American need to learn things about these other cultures so that I can be successfully navigating myself in those cultures. So we learn to ask, like in Spanish, where's the bathroom? Or in French, where's the restaurant? Where can I get a croissant? Or something like that. And we often we look at foreign language and say, oh, it's all written from a self perspective. But really, so many of our classes are from a selfish perspective. What am I learning? What can I get out of this? How's this going to help me? As opposed to reorienting our framework, how can I help others? Which, again, if we bring it back to biblical worldview formation, a biblical worldview is not about life being revolved around me. It's a life that's revolved around serving God's greater purposes in his kingdom in whatever vocation I have. So these subtle ways, and maybe not so subtle ways, of training our students from the earliest on help to build that expectation that life is not about me.
Mm-hmm. This is fun. This is opening up a new way of thinking about education that I think is very, very powerful. The comment about foreign language textbooks is really mind-boggling, because that is true. It's one thing that makes it difficult for teachers to teach is that they are trying to teach 20 individual students all at one time.
Yeah.
But if all of a sudden the focus is, how is what we are learning here going to help us bring flourishing and blessing to others?
Yes.
Then every project is kind of a group project, because
Right.
the strength of our team then, the strength of our class isn't just a class of individuals, it's a team. And the strength of the team is going to be the strength of the application of what we're learning.
Right. And just think of the potential of that. And I should say, I'm seeing people catch that vision more and more. And I'm certainly not the first person to have talked about this. I'm just a composite of others that have talked about it, and I'm maybe communicating in it a different way. But just imagine the difference between an organization that has no vision and is just kind of like going through the motions of managerial stuff. Compare that to an organization that has a strong vision that's matched with action to fulfill that mission. Man, where do people want to work when they grow up? I don't want to work in that just management job. I want to work in a place that has a vision. Well, apply that to our families. Do you want to grow up in a place that is just kind of managing life and kind of getting through one thing or another, or a family that has a strong mission for what God's called them to do and be? Apply it to the classroom. Do I want to go to third grade in a classroom where my teacher is just about getting everything done and maybe doing it in fun ways? Or would I flourish more as a human being, little third grade human being, in a third grade classroom that actually has an outward looking mission to serve others. Man, it's a radical change to how we can look at the classroom, our families, organizations.
Yeah. Well, this is part of the education revolution that I don't think has been talked about yet. We've mostly been talking about education delivery
Yes.
and how to give people more choices there.
Yeah.
But what actually takes place in the classroom, that's totally different.
Yeah, and
Okay.
go ahead.
No, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I do want to get to this because, again, we're thinking about back to school, and a lot of parents might be saying, okay, this is all great. I love the discussion. That's really ideal. My kid's teacher does not get this.
Yeah.
I don't, my school that we're in, they don't get this. Or I'm homeschooling and I just don't, I'm not sure how this is going to work for us. You were a head of school for
Yes.
many, many years.
Yep.
You saw a whole bunch of different families, hundreds of families. The children who came back to school in the fall who were well prepared and able to learn well and contribute well, what would you say those parents did differently?
Wow. They were very engaged in their children's overall formation, and they had intentionality and purpose in that formation process. So that would kind of be the broadest sense of the word. We can talk about their engaged with their kids' education. We can talk about that they, provide great experiences for the kids. But I think that all comes under that larger umbrella of parents who say, we are the primary formers or shapers of our children. And whether it's July or it's January, we are still very involved in our kids' formation. And I do think parents can quickly look forward to the end of summer as if dumping their kids back into the school where the primary shapers and formers of their kids are plying their trade. But I find the ones that come back most ready to learn in healthy and appropriate ways would be the ones whose families and households are worldview formation institutes in and of themselves. They're families that recognize they have to be applying what they're learning. They're families that don't bifurcate Monday from Sunday. They're families that are serving others together and find joy being together doing those sorts of things. So in broad brush, that's what I would say to that question.
Let's bring it down to a family level. Roger, what would that look like? Maybe, we've had one guest who said you got to reinstitute family dinners and you probably should get rid of social media from Monday through Friday, which is a radical thought for a lot of people. That would be a major, major shift and a positive one for a lot of families. But from your perspective, kind of take us through what this parent is actually doing differently. What are they saying differently? How are they talking to their kids differently?
Yeah, a whole slew of things, I would say, on a very practical level. So one would be that parents are reading themselves and are talking with their kids about what they're reading. So that's not a radical life change in terms of schedule or in terms of finance. And I'm not talking about signing up for all kinds of classes. I'm just simply saying setting the tone as lifelong learners for our kids and having lots of conversations with them about what we're learning. You mentioned the dinner table. That is pretty significant. Now, dinner table can be a stand-in or a metaphor for times when we gather with our kids for significant discussions. So whether it's around the dinner table or maybe in the summer, it's the breakfast table, I don't know. But it's a place where parents are challenging their kids and having discussions with them about things that matter. You're going to find that most of my suggestions, and probably from others, are not like radical life change, although I think radical life change in terms of like getting rid of social media and things like that might be helpful. But it's really harnessing the power of everyday moments to have meaningful conversations with our kids about the things that really, really matter, and role modeling a lifestyle of pursuing biblical worldview formation ourselves. Now, sometimes that will take the shape of actually, reading a book together. So Truth Changes Everything. Read it with our kids and talk about it. Go through those steps you have in each chapter and see how we as a family might be able to do some of those things. So that might be more formalized. So it's really I would say, a healthy dance between formalized, focused worldview development, formation things with our kids, and then harnessing the power of the everyday. And recently I was thinking a lot about Deuteronomy chapter 6, because we use that in the homeschooling world, we use that in the church world, we use that everywhere. And I had this thought recently. I think we normally think about that as, here's kind of this Jewish dad in ancient Israel plying his trade, and things come up and he talks with his kid. And I think that that's great. He talks about the word of God, the truth of God with his kid as things come up. But I recently kind of reimagined that. What if the dad, on the way to where they were going to ply their trade, knew in advance what he was going to point out as they walked around? So maybe he did a little back research. Now, I don't know how he would have done it there, but maybe he would have thought about trees or talked about various animals that they'd seen, so that he was prepared to actually have conversations about God's focus or God's perspective on those things. Or you can think of a mother who's going to, I don't know, do laundry at the riverside. Maybe as she walked, she had actually planned what conversation she was going to talk to her daughter about that day. So it's harnessing the power of everyday moments, but actually making choices to create everyday moments within our broader everyday moments where we can have those significant conversations with our students, our kids.
So intentionally bringing things up. This gives me a lot of confidence. I've loved to talk with my kids about different things that I'm learning, but it's fun to be alongside of your child in their discovery process.
Yes.
This is happening or this is happening, and wow, we could talk about this or that. And I think about, you mentioned trees or animals or, the sensitivity to things. I'm teaching my child to drive. Okay, so before we do this, let me just tell you, we live in a town where there are 500,000 people. And all of these people are going someplace for their own reasons and in a way that they think works best for them and keeps them safe.
Yeah.
They're thinking about themselves, and you have to flow in with everybody else. So, this is our community. This is our economy. This is why things work the way they do. This is why we are able to, in this community, have a high degree of people who are employed and who, but each person is doing it for their own reasons and thinking through their own things. So you've got to be a defensive driver.
Right.
It's things like, nobody ever said that to me. They just said, okay, get behind the wheel, push this one to go, push this one to stop, right? Yeah. I didn't understand that the act of driving was actually the act of participating in community.
Yes. I love that perspective. And I would add another perspective to that, because I don't want to be guilty of what we talked about right at the beginning, the academic fallacy, that if we think about things, we're being changed. That's part of our change process. But another element that I would see in really successful families that are raising sturdy kids that are having their biblical worldview developed, are coming back to school ready to roll, would be parents that help to incite wonder in their students.
Wow. Okay.
So that would be, let's go off on that driving analogy, would be as we're driving with our kids, which would be the equivalent of the Deuteronomy 6, that we plan to point out certain things that cause wonder in us. And by wonder, I mean kind of the wow factor or the awe of God's creation or the simple beauty. And I'm super sensitive to this right now because I now have 4 grandchildren who are just having their little worldviews developed. And so just pointing out the glory of a tree, but doing it in a way that elicits wonder, is another really powerful way that families can prepare their students to go back into the classroom and recapture some of that element of wonder that so many students have lost in the classroom.
Well, Roger, this has turned out to be very practical and helpful. I think the things you've talked about with the families you've seen be successful, that they're intentional, they are focused on a biblical worldview, they're thinking through how to use their everyday environment to reinforce a biblical worldview. They're thinking about how to use their everyday environment to inspire wonder. They're talking about their own learning and growth. indicating to their children that life is a process of learning and growing and discovering and creativity and wonder. Those are really significant.
And I would just continually stress for our own development and our children the idea of serving others, the idea of putting into practice the creation mandate or the cultural mandate, from Genesis chapter 1, involves stewarding what God has given us for the benefit of others under the rulership of the kingdom of God, and continually focusing on that. And I think a big challenge is for college students. If I would talk to one audience right now, it would be undergrad students who are getting ready to go back to school in probably less than a month, August 15th, 17th, something like that. For them to, and you've probably prayed this too, and we may have even talked about this in the past, where you should have a desire, but you don't have it yet. But from Scripture you should have it, so you might pray, Lord, help me to want, and fill in the blank. I would just encourage Christian undergrad students heading back to college who know the routine, who are just kind of going through the motions. They may love their learning, but there's a lot of transactions going on, academic transactions, to really stop and pray, Lord, help me to want to see beyond myself. Help me to want to see beyond my GPA. And how can I, moment by moment, day by day, whether it's walking to the dining hall, going to the gym to work out, or coming out of my classroom or going into my classroom, Lord, help me take what I'm learning, this huge investment my parents or me or the government is putting into me. Help me make the ROI on that investment skyrocket by taking what I'm learning and serving others.
Yeah. Wow. That's a great prayer. Roger, this has been a fun conversation. I'm really grateful. It's fun to have the opportunity to work with you. And as part of what you do in the work that we do together is you work with Christian schools, you travel, you work with their teachers, you work with their heads of school. And so there may be some opportunities as well for people who are watching or listening right now. If what you're hearing, you think, okay, we really need about an entire day to flesh that out. That's actually doable. You can actually do that.
Yes.
You could actually go there to their place, spend that time with them, and then help bring their teachers and everybody else to that place of wonder.
And I would add an encouraging thing that I'm seeing is more and more schools are saying, hey, you're coming in on Thursday. Could you come in a little early on Wednesday so you can address our parents the night before?
Yes.
So for parents too, and churches that are really looking to equip their parents, this is equally applicable. We change it a little bit. We make it more applicable to families, but this is all the same concepts that families desperately need.
Yeah. Well, I occasionally get to do that. It's not really part of my job, but I occasionally get to go to individual schools like that.
Yeah.
And I think my favorite part is when I meet with the student body.
Yes.
They're just, it's so much fun if you can help them feel safe to learn and feel like they can take risks and it's okay and it's cool and they can understand things that they didn't think they could understand. And they get to ask questions. They get to ask all their hard questions. All of that just creates this great environment, which it feels to me like that's what education is all about.
Yeah, right.
The wanting to want,
Yes.
that we're here to, we're facilitating their hunger and their thirst more than we are cramming stuff down their throats.
Yes. And I would say that's one of the biggest transformations in Christian schools that's happening. It is happening. Is we're seeing ourselves as educators less as content dispensers, and this is no, knock on truth by any means, but we're less content dispensers and much more facilitators of wonder and helping our students to desire what's right, good, true, and beautiful. And I think that's an exciting and a much more exciting proposition.
Yeah. Well, Roger, thanks for the conversation. I'm really grateful. I'm hoping that the series that we're doing here is helpful to families as you head back to school. And I especially appreciate your shout out to the students who are in a college or university.
Yes.
Because that's a big part of our audience as well. We love them all. And sometimes when you focus on one specific topic, it's hard to, match up with all these audiences, but you did that. So, man, so grateful. Thanks for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy the show, please consider leaving a review on your favorite platform. The reviews help more people find out about the show. It boosts the show on the platform. And that also helps get the word out about the truth of a biblical worldview. Speaking of getting the truth out about a biblical worldview, Summit Ministries, the sponsor of this show, has resources that can help you. It can help students, parents, educators, church leaders all learn how to develop a biblical worldview, become confident about it, and then actually shape the culture in which we live. So go to summit.org/resources. You can find the articles, videos, ebooks, and more there. We'll see you next week. Hey, are you looking for more great podcasts that can help build your faith and give you inspiration? Our friends at Edify have what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. You download it at edify.app or search for it in the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. Spell Edify, Edifi.